It's episode 79 of the Author Stories podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner. Find all the archives of the show at hankgarner.com. Today I'm joined by author Jason Gurley. Jason is the author of the newly released novel, Eleanor. If you remember, Jason was the very first guest on Author Stories, and Jason returns today to tell us all about the journey from self-publishing Eleanor to having that book acquired by Crown Publishing and now the re-release. While you're at hankgarner.com, please take just a moment to click on the iTunes link and go rate the show and leave a comment. Also, if you don't mind, click on the Amazon banner and do your normal shopping through Amazon, and the Author Stories podcast gets a small commission on your purchases. Thank you for listening. Now on to our show with Jason Gurley. Thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast. I'm your host, Hank Garner, and today I'm very excited to bring a full circle episode to you. My very special guest is Jason Gurley, who was the very first guest on this podcast about a year and a half ago. So from episode 1 to episode 79, I think this is. Welcome back to the show, Jason.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be back.
You're very welcome. And so today is a very auspicious day, or I guess today and yesterday. The brand new edition of Eleanor dropped yesterday. We're recording this on Wednesday. It came out yesterday on Tuesday. And when I last talked to you, you had recently published Eleanor. You had recently self-published it. I guess it had been on a couple or 3 months when we last talked. And this book has gone through quite a journey before you self-published it, and then another journey now. How are you feeling today?
Goodness, I don't even know. It's hard to get a sense of how I feel in the moment.
Yeah.
This is all very, very new to me and unexpected, and I certainly never thought when I started the book that I would actually arrive at this destination. But give me a week or two and then ask me again, and we'll see. We'll see how I'm feeling.
Will do. You can feel free to comment on the post when we post it next week, and give everybody an update whether it's sustained or not. Just for those who may not be familiar with the book and with you and kind of what's gone on this last year, what is Eleanor? Who is Eleanor, and what is the story of her about?
Sure. Well, Eleanor is the story about a family, really, that's been besieged by tragedy. If you think of them as a boat, this is a family that, like, the hull has been breached, they've been battered around, they're coming apart, and Eleanor is the 14-year-old girl who's treading water in the wreckage, desperately trying to hold the family together. And that's right about the moment that really strange and unusual things start to happen to her, and she has to struggle to understand how to restore her family to what they once were, if they ever were that thing to begin with.
Gotcha. Where did the first idea for the story come from?
That's a hard one to answer. The story changed a lot over the last, it's been almost 15 years. And I remember specifically that it came to me as I was driving a car through Oregon at like 4 o'clock in the morning on my way home from, a Thanksgiving vacation. And this line just appeared in my head as you do the thing when you're driving, you're just staring blankly at the horizon and the sun's not quite up and you're squinting and trying to see, and your mind goes to weird places. And my mind went off to someplace without me and came back with this line. For all of her life, Eleanor had been falling. And I had no idea who Eleanor was or where she was falling from. where she was falling to, didn't know how old she was, what her background was, nothing. But I recognized that line. And I think most writers, when things like this happen to them, they know if they get something good. And I knew that was a good line. So I started kind of building off of that as I was driving. And, I got back home. This was around 2001, I think. I was 23 years old. I'd written a few novels before this, but never something personal. And I sat down to write this novel, still not knowing where it was going. And everything that I was kind of going through in my own life started to filter into the book at the time. And that really set me on this decade-long path of thinking the book was one thing entirely, and not realizing that 12 or 13 years down the road I would understand that I was writing the wrong book, or that I still didn't know what this book was about, and it would take that long to figure it out.
Wow. So when you first started envisioning this book and just kind of getting to know the character, and I've read a couple of blog posts and different things that you've published the last couple of days in some different places. You talked about, and I didn't know this the first time we talked, but it seemed that, like you said, Eleanor is a very different book to begin with. Would you like to talk a little bit about how, as writers, we tend to project ourselves into the stories, and what was it that when you realized this was a different kind of book, how did you switch gears and say, okay, now I understand what's going on, and how do I fix this?
Well, yeah, I don't mind talking about that. Okay. To give you some context for that, I think you have to go back much further than 2001. It sounds like you might have read some of the pieces that I wrote recently about this, but I grew up in a Pentecostal home. And for those of your listeners who don't know what Pentecost is, it's a very, in my mind, a very restrictive subset of Christianity. It believes in the kinds of things you would see parodied on, like the X-Files, when they go deep into the South and they discover some little church in the woods. There's people speaking in tongues and dancing and running and that sort of thing. So that's where I grew up, and it was really restrictive, and there wasn't a lot of emphasis placed on asking questions. There was a lot of go along, stay with the flow. And as I got older, it took me a long time to get around to this. I was in my late teens and early 20s when I first realized that I could give myself permission to question all of those things, that it was okay, that I was officially an adult and I could make those decisions for myself. That took longer than I had hoped to, but I was asking a lot of questions that no one around me wanted to try to answer or could answer, and I wasn't finding answers. And I started to read as widely as I could. I was discovering books by people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Carl Sagan, most importantly. And these sort of led me to looking at the world in a very different way. But I felt very conflicted about that. I had grown up in the church. All my friends and family were in the church. Everything I knew revolved around the church. So leaving it meant that I was going to be sacrificing the entire framework that I existed in. And, looking back on it, I still don't know how I had the guts to do it. It startles me that I was able to, and I'm so glad that I was able to. But that was sort of the frame of mind that I was in when I wrote Eleanor in the beginning, and the book started to reflect that. Eleanor basically was me. And the original story for the book was this girl who is not particularly religious, but she goes cliff diving with some friends, and she has this terrible accident, and she winds up in a coma. And while she's in this coma, she has this experience where she meets someone. She has a conversation with someone, and it's so transcendent and metaphysical and beautiful. She just wants to linger in that forever. And she's convinced she's talking with God. And when she comes out of the coma, the rest of the world just looks kind of bleak and desiccated and dried out. And so the book was going to be about her struggle to replicate that experience in her real life, so that her whole life didn't feel like this washed out memory of a great moment that might not have been real. And, that's where it started. And I wrote that from those early days in 2001 until, goodness, I took a break from the novel in about 2012. And I wrote a few other books and self-published those. And when I came back to Eleanor afterward, that's when I realized I couldn't relate to this story at all anymore. I still love these characters. I lived with them for longer than anybody in my real life, short of my immediate family. And they meant a lot to me. But I realized that I was trying to force my story onto them. And so that's when I sort of deconstructed it all and began looking for what their story would be. And it became this family saga that's all about memory and regret and loss and grief and things like that.
So it began as a very cathartic experience for you.
Yeah. It's interesting. I always expected that it would be that. And I knew... Well, here's the thing. So I thought that I knew where I was going with Eleanor all those years ago.
Yeah.
One of the first things I wrote was the ending, which would be sort of an ambiguous ending because I wanted the reader to come away thinking, well, maybe she did find what she was looking for, but maybe she didn't. And maybe that's okay. I wrote that ending and then went back to the beginning and started writing the whole story very linearly, not realizing that because I was projecting my own big questions onto this story and onto this character, that I would find myself unable to write all of the parts in between the beginning and the ending because I didn't have those answers. I had no idea how to answer the big questions that I was asking. And that just meant that I was in this deep sense of churn for a very long time, just writing and rewriting the same parts, the same words over and over, looking for anything I could do to make the story feel like it was the right voice without having to answer those big questions because I just couldn't do it.
Do you think that as well, let me think of how to say this. As writers, we obviously bring our worldview and our preconceptions and everything that makes us who we are. We bring that to the writing desk when we sit down to write. Obviously, those things will naturally bleed into what we do. How, from what you've learned from this experience, how can we make that process easier to separate ourselves from what we write, so that we're free to write the story as the story is without having to answer all the questions? Is that a skill that you just have to practice and learn, or is there anything that you've learned through this process that makes that easier?
Okay, so to answer that question, for me, especially with Eleanor, I found myself writing me for a very long time. Sure. And in retrospect, I think that the decision to write the book from the perspective of a teenage girl, who is very, very far removed from my own experience, that was a decision that I made to try to address exactly what you're asking. I wanted to give myself that objectivity that I didn't think I could bring if I wrote a story about a teenage boy. And it's a very small distinction for sure, but it's not one that I truly took as seriously as I think I could have at that age. Interesting. Sorry, I got distracted here because I said seriously, and my phone woke up and said, "What can I help you with?"
I love it.
So I guess my point is that that's a learned skill for sure, and I wasn't nearly as experienced at the time as I needed to be. So when I went back to the novel and restructured it and rewrote it and rebuilt that story just a few years ago, I think I was much more prepared for that. I think I had a better sense of how to write a character who wasn't just a mouthpiece for me. But I do think that it takes time. There are little things you can do to sort of disguise your own voice, like making the character the opposite gender or giving that character a different background. But none of that really works if you're not leaving your own voice as far behind as you can.
Yeah. I find this whole experience that you had a nearly fully structured story that you then just completely deconstructed and rebuilt from the ground up, but retaining the characters. I know a lot of authors would hold that sacred at some point. You know, this is I've invested all of this. This thing is complete or nearly complete, and you know that they would never go through that effort. What was that difficult for you to say? You know what, I've got 10 years or so invested in this, and I'm just going to completely scrap it. Kind of what was that when you came to that realization? What was that feeling like for you, and how did you move forward?
Well, it definitely wasn't. It wasn't easy in the beginning to think of it that way. You know, I did spend a lot of time on this book, and that time that I spent really felt like earned time. Like it was not easy. Yeah. All those years. I would set out down one path and hit a dead end and come back and set out down another one. And I felt like I'd really put in the time I deserved to tell this story and get it over the finish line. But it also just wasn't working. You know, I even took a break from the book around 2010 or so and tried to adapt it as a comic book instead, because I thought that maybe shifting the medium would help to jar loose whatever just wasn't working. And that didn't work, although it was a fun distraction for a little while. But I think what finally worked for me was literally walking away from the book and writing other works and reminding myself that, you know, I did know how to write. This book was not this albatross that I would never finish. I could finish a project. I wasn't just this struggling writer who would never ever get to the end. I wasn't Grady Tripp from Wonder Boys, you know, writing his 2,500 page, you know, monstrosity.
Right.
But going away from the book and then coming back to it, that helped to ease the pain, I think, of deciding to chuck it into the garbage, essentially. And it also helped to give me the confidence that I knew how to fix what wasn't working before.
Gotcha. What was it about these characters that endeared themselves to you that you were willing to completely restructure their stories, but these people survived?
Well, with Eleanor herself, I think it was... I'm going to contradict what I said earlier about not putting your own voice into a character, but I think that two of the most powerful values that a person can have are being thoughtful and being curious. And I think that Eleanor represented that. And she represented that in a world where, whether you're looking at the original story or the story that it would become, she is surrounded by adversity. And yet she still remains thoughtful and deeply attentive to those around her and powerfully curious about these weird things happening to her. And I suppose that those two things, they're so me that I don't think I was ever going to get away from those with Eleanor herself. And so I keep finding myself drawn back to that aspect of her character, and I didn't want to let that go without seeing where she would go with it.
Yeah. You talked about writing other stories in that time where you took a break from Eleanor, and you've written a lot of science fiction, some pretty straightforward science fiction. Eleanor, to me, is a very different book than some of the other things you've written. was any of that a conscious effort? And would you say that you gravitate more naturally toward more straight science fiction, or some of this kind of odd fantasy? Do you have a preference?
I think it's really hard for me to classify myself as one or the other. I consider myself fairly widely read. I like a lot of different things, and that really is a struggle in my own work. Is to, as much as I want to write the novel where the planet falls out of the sky and crashes onto the other planet, and that's exciting and fun to write, I also want to write like a workplace novel, with people whose primary obsessions are how many paper clips they have left. And I'm so enthralled by so many different kinds of stories that I have a hard time just picking one straight path and sticking to that. And it's interesting that you would refer to the science fiction as maybe the primary thing, because I guess I see myself a little bit differently because that aspect is so recent. And the novels that I wrote prior to Eleanor, they weren't really genre novels. In fact, they were... Let me tick these off for you. So I wrote the very first novel that I ever wrote when I was 18. And all I wanted at that age was to write a winning novel that would make me some sort of literary superstar. And at 18, that's what you dream of.
Right, right.
So that's the novel I wrote at 18. It was about a young kid becoming a literary superstar.
Nice.
And the second one that I wrote is about this very, very old writer reflecting on his life as a literary superstar. The third one, I started to get away from that a little bit and really sort of explore how to fork different genres together. And it's hard for me to classify literary as a genre per se. So in that third book, I was running together sort of a crime story and a family drama at the same time. And then Eleanor started. And I didn't really write straight science fiction like I've self-published until I actually self-published. And that was only 3 years ago.
Wow. That's fascinating to me, because I think we can all look back and see growth in our work, but that's wild to me. But when the first thing of yours I read was Eleanor, and my first reaction was, wow, this very much feels like, and I can't even quantify what I mean by feels like, but I got this feeling when I was reading it that it felt very, very much like Neil Gaiman, kind of like the ocean at the end of the lane, and that's just the vibe I got from it. And then I read some of your other self-published stuff, and I was like, oh wow, this is very different. So yeah, that was just it's great to look back and see different things that we're interested in, and know that we can pursue those. I'm glad to know that we don't have to be pigeonholed like that.
Sure, but you've also kind of hit on something that is an interior conflict of my own, which is those are very different books.
Yeah.
Eleanor is wildly different from, let's say, The Man Who Ended the World, or from Great Fall. And one of my interior conflicts is Eleanor is the book that I think best defines what I would like to achieve as a writer. And for me, that's a fantastic first step to take publicly. For readers will discover Eleanor in a way that they haven't discovered anything that I've written before. But if they are drawn to Eleanor and they go looking at everything I've published before, I worry about that the difference between those works will be so great that they will really struggle to reconcile, the science fiction author side of me with the fantasy, literary, whatever side of me. I don't know how to address that. All I want to do is just write what I want to write, and people will make up their own minds about how to, I guess, classify me. We tend to classify everybody, I suppose.
I hope that the trend over the last few years of writers having more freedom to maybe hybrid publish, where they have a certain work that they're doing with this publisher, and maybe they're self-publishing some, maybe they're doing some with a small press. Maybe people are are kind of loosening up their expectations a little bit in seeing that, and we can be more liberal with our allowing our writers to do what they want to do.
I think that's possible. I think it's pretty true. I also think there's just the very different environment we all exist in, where people just live very, very public online lives. And it's easy to go back now and see somebody's earliest blog post that they wrote 25 years ago, and you might struggle to reconcile that with the person that they are now. But I think the fact that it exists, that almost a history of that person exists in the world for you to discover, maybe makes people a little bit more forgiving when they find things that don't quite, create a perfect handoff between themselves.
Yeah. The one question I had, just logistically, how did you keep up with a novel for 15 years? How do you keep that project, from, do you have an original Word document that you started on and you've transferred from computer to computer? How do you manage a project for 15 years?
That's a really good question. It kind of is what you've pointed out. I do have this set of, digital files that I've had for a very, very long time, just hanging out on various hard drives and in various places. And it's interesting to go back and look at some of those earliest ones that served as my work files back in 2001 and 2003 and so on. I work very differently now than I did back then, but they are interesting artifacts. I can see the moments where the voice of the book would shift. I would discover, 60,000 words into the book that the voice was very different than what I thought it had been. And I would go back to the very beginning and I would rewrite the whole book to get the voice right. And this is part of the churn that I described earlier. I would do that, and then I'd keep writing for another month or two, and then I'd have another epiphany about the whole thing and go back to the beginning and start over again. And I never really thought about it. I guess I just kept working with the same files forever.
That's great.
Goodness. I might have lost it once, and I think I had a print copy to work from, but thankfully that didn't happen later. There's a lot more redundancy now than there used to be for me.
I can imagine. Did you allow other people to read the book as you worked on it all those years?
I did. I'm not ashamed to admit that I'm a writer who desperately wants to hear that what I'm working on is good.
I think a lot of us are that way.
Yeah, I think we are, and I don't want to hear that it's bad. I usually know when it's not working. I want to hear the good things, and I will come back and fix the things that aren't so good. But yes, I think my sister is probably the earliest reader who saw the book. She's a blogger and a writer herself. I remember reading the book aloud to her to get her feedback on it back when we were in our early 20s. I think there might have been one particular moment that it put her to sleep. It's possible that it might have been a different book that I've been working on, but that definitely happened at some point.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, I did that, and then of course when I rewrote the book with the intent of self-publishing it, one of the things I did then was formally share it with a lot of my existing readers who would give me their feedback, and some of that feedback I could take, and some really mattered to the book, and some of it didn't, and it was not always easy to tell what to keep and what not to, but thankfully my editor helped me sort through that. And there were a couple of readers in particular who spotted errors in the book that were so critical and that I did not even notice existed at the time. I had a reader who pointed out that cirrhosis of the liver did not just turn into cancer spontaneously, that sort of thing. So I have a character who's experiencing, there's an alcoholic character in the book who has this kind of issue, and I had to solve that. And another character would point out that the kind of car you just put that character in didn't exist in 1963. Things like that.
Gotcha. Well, the big story about this since we last talked is that when a year and a half ago you self-published Eleanor with this gorgeous cover. This book really stood out, started to get a lot of great reviews, got a lot of people were talking about it. Hugh Howey talked about it. A bunch of very high-profile people were buzzing about the book. A lot of people bought it and were loving it. And then something happened last year, and the book disappeared. And for it to reappear yesterday, what happened? And tell us, kind of walk us through that experience for you. I know that when we first talked, we talked about self-publishing a little bit, and I remember distinctly you said something to the effect that you were very open to your work being picked up by a publisher, or that you were not ruling out any possibilities, and evidently that happened. So tell us, kind of walk us through what happened.
Sure. Well, you kind of answered your own question there, but
yeah.
So yeah, I self-published the book in June of 2014, and a couple of weeks before it was available, I got this email from a film producer, or it was a development executive at a film production company, asking if the rights to Eleanor were available. And I think it was just a shot in the dark from this person, because the book wasn't out there. There was no way they could have read it just yet. They only saw it on Amazon, available for pre-order, and it did pretty well for pre-orders. So I'm sure this person might have just been skimming the lists on Amazon, and a lot of people probably got those emails. But I took it seriously, and I knew that if I was going to have a conversation with someone about film rights, if I did it on my own, I would just shoot myself in the foot like 20 times. And so I didn't want to do that alone. So I resumed looking for a literary agent. I met my new agent that way, or my current agent. It's hard to call him new. He's had me on board for 2 years now. But in any case, he signed me and effectively decided to sort of just stop the film conversation right there, with the intent of doing a little bit of touch-up work to the book and then taking it out to publishers to see if anybody was interested. And I was on board with that because, after spending, more than 10 years on a book, you certainly want it to have the widest possible reach that it can have. And, and I was self-publishing at the time. I had done fairly well self-publishing books, but I was still light years away from being anywhere near, say, Hugh Howey. And I didn't necessarily want to rule out any possible avenues to finding those readers. So that's pretty much what happened. We worked on the book for a few months, which was very surreal. Like, the book is out in the world, being sold, people are reading it, and here I am still, editing and revising it to submit it to publishers. And then we took it to publishers, I think, in early October of 2014. It's kind of funny. My agent Seth told me, don't sit by the phone. Like, this moment in the process can take months. Sometimes it takes years. Like, it can take a little while.
Right.
And then I think it was like 3 days later, he's like, "Hey, can you talk to an editor at Crown?" And I said, "Sure." And I had this fantastic phone call with my editor at Crown, and that was on a Friday. And on Monday, Crown made a preemptive offer to buy the rights to Eleanor. And it was just out of the blue. It just happened. It's like, it didn't take months. It didn't even take a week. So that happened, nuts. And goodness, it just kind of went from there.
Yeah. Did they give you any feedback initially? And I know you went through some more rounds of edits, but did anything major structurally change in the book?
Not really. Not really. Most of it was just kind of, polishing this and massaging that. There were no changes to the major structure. It was more, there are moments in the book that had the potential to have quite a bit more impact than they did. And so we looked at how to draw that out. And I think we spent about 2 or 3 months sort of going back and forth on some edits before it went into the more mundane editing, the copy editing and proofreading and that sort of thing.
What was it like for you? Was it a scary decision, knowing that your book is out there, you're collecting reviews, you're getting some buzz, going about the book, and then to have it just go away? Were you scared that you would lose momentum on it, or were you confident in the process all along?
I don't think I was scared. There were certainly things I was scared of, but that wasn't one of them. The book stayed online for, another 7 or 8 months at that point. I think it finally went offline in April or May of last year. So it was still out there. It was still being bought. People were still reading it and sharing it, and that didn't bother me so much. The things that were scary were just, I mentioned earlier being a curious person, and I've been accused by people in very friendly ways of being sort of a completist. Like, if there's something that interests me, I want to know everything about it that I possibly can. If I like a movie, yeah, I want to know what they shot it on and how long it took for them to go through production and how many times it failed to get financed. I want to know everything.
Yeah.
And I do that with writing and publishing as well. So my whole life that I can recall, I would read every foreword and afterword and acknowledgement section of every book, and I would read every interview with every author that I loved and go to author readings and ask questions. And of course, when I was self-publishing, I went deep on that as well and tried to understand everything that I could about it. And there's so much fear around the publishing world because, so many books appear every year, and only so many of those books are going to have any real impact. Like, it's more common for a book to fail than it is for a book to do well. And so I went into this whole new stage of Eleanor's life being very aware of all of the potential ways that it could go sideways. And being so wrapped up in that, to the point that my wife looks at me and she's like, "You've taken this book farther than you ever hoped to take it. How are you not just enjoying this?" And that's what I realized. I'm like, oh, she's right. I'm fixated too much on all of the outcomes that I can't control. If things happen with this book at some point, it's well beyond my ability to change that. So I've really been working on just allowing myself to enjoy as much of this as I can, knowing that it's my first time through it. I'll never have this first time again. And I'll never have a day like yesterday, the first day that a book is on bookshelves on its release day, like everywhere. And it's magical. I love it. And it's completely out of my hands now. I have to let it go and let it do what it will do.
Well, I know a lot of people were living that moment with you through your post on Facebook and social media. You posted these great photos of you and your daughter, going around town to go to all the bookstores, and it was just amazing. I know a lot of people were kind of armchair cheering for you to see that happen. It was such a great experience.
That was really nice. I had debated how to spend that day for years, And you go into it having all these completely wrong-headed ideas, like publishing day means you've arrived, the crowds are waiting for you, there's confetti, but it's not like that at all. And right. I wanted to hold on to a moment for myself. And my wife had to work yesterday, or she would have been with us, but my daughter and I just made an adventure of it. We went to every bookstore that we could think of, and we would hunt for the book. And to my amazement and to her giddiness, it wasn't hard to find at all. it was prominently displayed at most of the stores we went to. And that was an exciting and a very new thing for me. And it just, that's what I mean when I say I still don't quite know how to feel about it, just because it's so foreign and so exciting and so new. And so ask me in a few weeks.
I will. But yeah, I popped into our local kind of big box bookstore that we have here in small town Mississippi, and there's Eleanor, prominently displayed toward the front of the store.
That's
and
so
I was
exciting.
like, man, that's so. I think a lot of people were living vicariously through that experience with you.
Yeah.
Like one of our own made it. It's really cool.
This makes me feel good about deciding to, sign up with Crown and to let them take the book out into the world, because it does validate that their reach is just enormously greater than my own. I can't do that. I can't put my book, if I self-publish it, I can't put my book into that bookstore in your hometown.
Yeah. Well, do you have any? Of course, this is the day after release date, and you don't have prospective past publishing yet. But I think a lot of people, people in general, we like to group into tribes, and my tribe is better than your tribe, and we do things better than you, and everybody on the other side thinks the exact same thing, about the other side. And we do tend to have some of these pointless arguments about, well, the publishing is broken, and the only thing that you can do if you want to retain your artistic integrity is to self-publish. And then, the other side says, well, we're the only ones that have any validity. And, we get into these crazy, arguments back and forth. But as someone who had some success self-publishing and then now has a major release out with Crown, have you formed any opinions regarding that?
Well, I do agree.
And that's a very loaded question, I know.
It's totally loaded. That's a fair question to ask. I do agree that both, if you look at both sides as, self-published authors and legacy or traditionally published authors, sure, it's very divisive. But I know plenty of authors who do both, and who consider both to be a perfectly valid avenue towards sharing your work with readers. And both have been that for me, or at least one has been that for me, and one looks like it's very likely to be that for me. And so I don't rule out either one for whatever next steps I'm taking with whatever next projects I work on. But I will say, from my perspective, as me, and not speaking for anybody else, it's exhausting, honestly, to be very, very deep in a community that is so bitter about experiences that, in a lot of cases, they have never personally had.
Right.
And I found myself just very, very tired of constantly standing in this water of this community and realizing that there's just a lot of pervasive anger, and a lot of I'm right and you're wrong. And I honestly, I don't care who's right and who's wrong. I want to tell good stories, or the best stories that I can tell, and then I want to find the best way to get them to people who might enjoy them. And that's it. I don't care if quote unquote legacy publishing is evil or better or right or wrong versus self-publishing. I think that there are wonderful authors on both sides of that table, and there are authors who stand in the middle, and I'm right there in the middle now. And I still look at self-publishing as something that I may or may not do, depending on what my project is and if it suits the project. And I still look at working with a publisher as that as well.
And they're very valid arguments on both sides. It's when you start taking those arguments as gospel for every situation that things start getting a little squirrely. That's yeah. Anyway, and it's all tools. I don't know carpenters that get angry with one another for using different brands of hammers. Or it's a little silly, when it's all we all want our stories to be as widely read as possible, and and we should all embrace whatever tools are available to us. But anyway,
I think that's all there is to it, frankly.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the rest of it is just noise that doesn't really serve the basic aspect of what we're trying to do, which is just be good storytellers and tell good stories and share those and enjoy the idea that we're contributing to this great legacy of stories passed down through time.
Yeah, absolutely. What are you working on now, Jason? I know that you've Eleanor has finally kind of taken wings and is through this long journey is out in the world for everyone to enjoy, and like you said, for the first time you have no control over what happens now. So what does an author do when you've set that free? I know you've got another book that you've been working on for a while, but what's coming up next for you?
Well, that's it. I'm still working on the next book, and it's a huge relief not to be worrying about Eleanor anymore, not to be rewriting those scenes, and that took a long time, and I did a lot of that, and it's nice to, for whatever reason, to have found the point where I just put that down and move on to the next thing. But the next book is it's in the similar vein. It's sort of that family saga mashes up with the idea of a fantastic other reality. But it's about trees. It's just about trees. And one of my friends, Annie,
the Limbs book.
Yeah, that's what I'm writing.
Yeah. So anyway, one of your friends. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, that's fine. Annie Belay, she's a fantasy author. One of my friends. Anytime she hears me talk about this book or runs into me, she's like, "How is the book about trees?" That's kind of how I think of it now. It's an inexplicably strange new thing I'm working on, and I'm going through a lot of the same trial and error that I went through with Eleanor, but not spending decades doing it. And so I think it's a fascinating new way to go, and it's really this one where Eleanor was all about family and loss and grief. This one is about the integrity of marriage and what happens when two people discover each other, and they find that each other they fulfill the greatest, deepest needs they've ever had, and then for reasons beyond their control, they lose each other. What happens to each of them, and what are their journeys like as they separate? And that's sort of the through line of what I'm working on now. It's a long way from done, but.
Well, I know the audience of this show loves Inexplicably Strange, so that's we look forward to it. To wrap up, we're going to put a link in the show notes where you can buy the newly released Eleanor on Amazon. I'm assuming that you can find it wherever fine books are sold.
I think pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Where can people connect with you, Jason, to follow your work?
The best place would be either my website, where I keep a blog. That's jasongurley.com. Or I'm Jay Gurley on Twitter. And you can usually find anywhere else I am through one of those two avenues.
All right, excellent. Has Crown expressed interest in the book about trees?
My editor is aware that it's being worked on. Of course, we don't have a deal in place for that book, so we'll see how Eleanor does and what lies ahead for that one.
Excellent. We look forward to it. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be